Chapter 11, the later Middle Ages. Um, this is a time period that is characterized by three major calamities that struck the 1300s or the 14th century. Um, Part one is going to deal with Prelude to the Disaster and the Black Death, and we've got two other parts that we're going to deal with because there really are three major disasters.
Too many cooks, 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 too many cooks.
So, about the year 1300, the climate in Europe became much colder and wetter. This became a period that historical geographers refer to as a Little Ice Age. An unusual number of storms ruined wheat, oat, and hay crops, resulting in poor harvests that led to scarcity and starvation. Almost all of Northern Europe suffered a great famine in the years 1315 to 1322. Even in non famine years, the cost of grain, livestock, and dairy products rose sharply, meaning fewer people could afford to buy food. Reduced caloric intake meant increased susceptibility to diseases, especially for infants, children, and the elderly. Workers on reduced diets had less energy, which in turn meant lower productivity, lower output, and higher grain prices. So all of this kind of builds together, and these have dramatic social consequences, like the changing climate and resulting agrarian crisis of the 14th century led to the abandonment of homesteads and even entire villages, as many people became vagabonds wandering in search of food and water. Overall, the population declined because of deaths caused by famine and disease, though the postponement of marriage as young men and women sought work in the towns, and the resulting decline in offspring also played a part. As the subsistence crisis deepened, starving people focused their anger on rich speculators and Jews who were often targeted as creditors fleecing the poor through pawnbroking. Rumors spread of a plot by Jews and their agents, the lepers, to kill Christians by poisoning wells, and many lepers and Jews were killed, beaten, or fined. So, the international character of trade and commerce meant that a disaster in one country had serious impacts elsewhere. For example, an infection attacked English sheep in 1318, resulting in a sharp decline in wool exports that put Flemish weavers out of work and thus hurt the businesses of Flemish, Hanseatic, and Italian merchants. Unemployment encouraged people to turn to crime. The government response to these crises, condemning speculators, forbidding exports of grain, setting price controls, attempting to import grain, were all relatively ineffectual. Most historians identified the diseases that spread in the 14th century as the bubonic plague caused by the Bacillus Yersinia pestis, a disease that normally affects rats. Fleas living on the infected rats drink their blood and pass the bacteria that caused the plague onto the next animal or human they bite. Only in the 1890s, during another outbreak, did doctors and epidemiologists identify the bacillus as bubonic plague and come to understand the cycle of infection. Because of differences between the 19th and 14th century outbreaks, some historians have questioned whether the Black Death was in fact bubonic plague. The medieval plague was often transmitted directly from one person to another through coughing and sneezing, as well as through flea bites. The classic symptoms of the bubonic plague was an agonizing, painful growth, the buba, the size of a nut or an apple, in the armpit or in the groin or in the neck. If the buba was not laced and drained, the next stage was the appearance of black spots or blotches caused by bleeding under the skin. Finally, the victim began to cough violently and spit blood, indicating the presence of millions of bacilla in the bloodstream. Death followed within 2 or 3 days. The coughing also released pathogens into the air, infecting others.
Now I'm going to put the kibosh on you. You know I've kiboshed before. And I will kibosh again.
Plague first kiboshed in southwest China, described in symptoms in 1333. Plague infected rats accompanied Mongol armies and merchant caravans across Central Asia in the 1330s, and then boarded ships that carried the disease to ports of the Black Sea by the 1340s. Medieval urban conditions proved ideal for the spread of disease. Mortality rates can only be educated guesses because population figures did not exist for most countries and cities in the pre-plague period. But the most widely accepted estimate is that one-third of the population of Western Europe and the Mediterranean died in the first wave of infection. Across Europe, the Black Death recurred intermittently in the following century, though never with the same virulence because Europeans had built up some resistance. Improved standards of hygiene and quarantine measures also lessened the plague's toll, but the plague continued to appear in Europe until 1721. In 1947, the American microbiologist Selman Waxman discovered an effective treatment for the plague. 14th century medical literature indicates the physicians tried many different things to prevent and treat the plague. They observed the crowded cities had high death rates, especially when the weather was warm and moist, but they thought in terms of poisons in the air or corrupted air that caused fluids in the body to become unbalanced. Treatment focused on ridding the air and body of these poisons and rebalancing bodily fluids. People tried anything they thought might help, ringing church bells, firing cannons, taking medicines from oozing plants, and creating cryptograms. Descriptions of the course of the diseases by Giovanni Bocciacchi in the Decameron reveal that many realized the disease passed from person to person. To avoid contagion, wealthier people often fled cities for the countryside, though sometimes this simply spread the plague faster. Some cities tried shutting the gates to prevent people from coming into the city.
Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
Others often walled up houses where the plague to attempt to isolate the sick. The plague doctor that was just shown is actually from the 16th century in Venice, so it was not part of the initial plague. New research has changed our view of what the plague did. The traditional view was that the plague had a disaster effect that led to a great change in the way that society was structured. And modern historians, most recent scholarship in the area, says that that's probably too simple of an explanation. Evidence seems to indicate that populations losses allowed less fertile land to be abandoned and prompted more specialized types of agriculture. The Black Death brought on European-wide inflation, but labor shortages meant that workers could demand better wages, and those who survived enjoyed a higher standard of living. The greater demand for labor also meant greater mobility for peasants and artisans.
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria!
People's sadness at the loss of their loved ones, especially their children, led some to seek release from the devastating affliction in wild living, but more became deeply pious. Rather than seeing the plague as a medical issue, people interpreted it as God's punishment for the terrible sins and sought remedy through prayer, donations to churches, and efforts to live better lives. Some Christians turned to the severest form of asceticism and frenzied religious fervor, joining groups of flagellants who whipped and scourged themselves as penance for their sins and society's sins. People also searched for scapegoats, and many came to believe that the Jews had infected the drinking water, which led to the expulsion and murder of thousands of Jews across Europe.
Are we the baddies?
The literature and art of the late Middle Ages revealed a terrible, morbid concern with death. A popular literary and artistic motif, the Dance of Death, depicted a dancing skeleton leading away living people.
Super fun, happy side!
No, Dad.
New colleges and universities were founded whose charters specifically cited the shortage of priests and the decay of learning as a reason for their establishment. These new institutions had more national and local constituency, which weakened the international character of medieval culture. As is often true with devastating events, the plague highlighted central qualities of medieval society: deep religious feeling, suspicion of those who were different, and a view of the world shaped largely by oral tradition, with a bit of classical knowledge mixed in among the educated elite. Next, in part 2, we will discuss the 100 Years' War.